in the Yahwist strand, Exodus, Numbers. There's some Garden of Earthly Delight. Say that Bosch, yes, Hieronymus Bosch, yes, a crazy. Didn't get burnt at the stake is absolutely beyond me. How do you do? I mean, because there's three pieces of this. A very looking at that painting. I don't know what it was with Bosch, but once, and probably for the best. And some Bosch, yeah. Garden of Earthly Delights. What's his name? Say that again. Bosch. How he didn't get burnt at the stake is absolutely beyond me. I suppose most of you do. You could spend, because there's three pieces of this particular painting. Because there's three pieces of this particular painting. Bizarre and surreal month looking at that painting. Sort of creature that only popped up once, and probably for the best. And God only knows what that is. It's like, and then look, I mean, that's the lion lying down with the lamb, right? So that there was a time, or maybe will be a time, when the horrors of life are no longer necessary for life itself to exist. Or, of course, that everything eats everything else, and that everything dies, and that everything's born, and that the whole bloody place is in charge. And this is the vision of it being other than that. And, you know, there's a strong idea, this was also in scientific revolution, that human beings can interact. Elements of it can be mitigated. Characterized, well, that's obviously imagistic, but it might be characterized by something like that, where we have the benefits of actual existence without all of the catastrophe that seems to go along with it. And Carl Jung, of science from alchemy, he thought of science as being motivated by a dream, because for Jung, instincts, it was the boundary between the instincts and thinking. He said, well, that if we investigated the structures of material reality with sufficient attention, material reality to alleviate suffering, right? To produce the philosopher's stone, to make everybody wealthy, to make everybody healthy, to make everyone live as long as they wanted to live. The catastrophe of existence, and that idea, the idea that mysteries, the enable us to develop such a substance, or let's say a multitude of substances, provided the motive force for the development of science. And Jung traced the development of that motive force really over 1,000 years. And if you're interested in reading his books on alchemy, which are extraordinarily difficult, and that's really saying something about Jung, because all of his books are difficult, and then the books on alchemy, they kind of take a quantum leap. That's actually a very small leap, so I shouldn't say that. They take a massive. That's what he was trying to get at. He went back into the alchemical texts and interpreted them as if they were the dream on which science was founded. Hypotheses are certainly well supported by the historical facts. Science did emerge out of alchemy. The question is, what were the alchemists up to? A medicament for mankind's pathology. Jung felt that what had happened was that, you know, Christianity had promised that, the cessation of suffering, promised it for 1,000 years, and yet suffering went on unabated. And at the same time, Christianity had attempted to really put emphasis on spiritual development, let's say, at the expense of development as something akin to a sin, trying to get a control of impulsivity and all the things that went along with a two-embodied existence. by about 1000 AD, the European mind, somewhat educated by that point, somewhat able to concentrate on a single point, perhaps just training, turned its dream to the spiritual redemption that we've been seeking didn't appear to produce the result that was promised or intended, and so maybe the damned material world, right, which was supposed to be, at least according to some elements of classic thinking, nothing but the creation of the devil. So, but the point I'm making, underestimate the amount of human motivation that's embedded in the attempt to help people live a healthy life, and well, that's the disease, obviously, but to live a long life as well, and to make things as peaceful as possible. I mean, you can be cynical about people, and you can talk about them as motivated the baby with the bathwater, because we have been striving for a very long time to set things right, and we've done actually not too bad a job of it for half-starving, crazy, insect-ridden years. So, you know, we could deserve a bit of. So. Some other representations. Paradise has a walled garden, and that's what paradise means. It's paradisa. It's associated with Persian. Paradisa means walled garden. And why a walled garden? Well, it goes back to the chaos order idea. So this is where God puts man. The wall is culture and order, and the garden is nature, and the idea is the proper human habitat is nature and culture in balance. It's, well, we like gardens. Well, why? Because, well, they're not completely covered with. They're civilized a little bit, but still within that civilization, nature in its more benevolent guise is encouraged to flourish, and people find the proper habitat of a human being is a walled garden, is a good one. I mean, raccoons, for example, you want to keep those things out, man, even though it's impossible. And you know, you don't want, well, there's all sorts of things you don't use against them, but the idea that paradise is a walled garden is walls, culture, right? Garden, nature. So the proper human habitat. Radical left-leaning, anti-theist environmentalists tend to make the case that the predations of the Western capitalist system are a consequence of the injunction that was delivered in Genesis by God to the earth. David Suzuki has talked a lot about this, by the way. They believe to our inappropriate assumption that we have the right to exert control. Terrible predatory monsters, sometimes described as cancers on the face of the earth, or viruses that have inhabited the entire earth, and wreaking havoc as rapidly as we possibly can, which is another perspective on the essential, absolutely deplorable. I mean, if you look at the historical record, for example, even casually, you'll find out 95 thereabouts, Thomas Huxley, who was Aldous Huxley's grandfather and a great defender of Darwin, prepared a report for the British government on fish away, guys, man. There's so many fish out there. The oceans are so inexhaustible that no matter how hard humanity, probability that we could do more than put a dent in what was out there. Wrong. He didn't realize that our population was going to spike so dramatically, partly because we got a little bit rich and our children stopped dying at the rate of like. Actually managed to populate the earth with a few people, but it wasn't really until 1960 or so that we woke up to the fact that there were so many of us on the planet, and that's like what, 50 years ago. Well, we've just started to develop the technology, the wherewithal to consider it a garden, and we need to live inside the proper balance between culture and order, or culture and chaos. Not to die, and usually very unsuccessfully. So Genesis, I don't believe that it's given human beings the right to act as environment for human beings is presented quite properly as a garden, and that the role of people, and that's explicitly stated in the second story in Adam and Eve, was to tend the garden. Decisions and to make sure that everything thrives and flourishes, and so that it's good for the things that are living there that aren't just people, but also good for the. Note that that's a slightly different take on the story than the ultimately cynical interpretation that's so commonly put forward today. Now, is a couple of trees, and Adam and Eve and some animals and all of that, and unfortunately the tree happens to have a snake wrapped around it. Now that's an interesting thing. We're going to talk about that a lot. This is no ordinary snake. Say it's got a human head, and it's got a human head there too. So whatever that snake is, from a religious perspective, like if you can, just imagine that you're an anthropologist and you've never seen this image before. You see something, a fairly pleasant enclosure, and then you see a tree, and people are eating from the tree, but the tree has a snake in it that has a human head. And so then you might think, well, what's a snake with a human? Revelatory, it's just self-evident. So whatever that snake is isn't just a snake. It's snake and human. Or it's snake and partakes in whatever human beings are. And that's very important, so we'll consider. And you see, in this particular version, there's the head. This one also has wings, and so this is a winged snake, sort of like a dragon, and so it crawls on the ground like a reptile, and it's got a snake, which is like the lowest form of reptilian life, so something that crawls on the ground. It's something that's human and something that's spiritual at the same time. Mushrooms, by the way, and you can look that up if you want. That's quite an interesting little rabbit hole to wander down if you're curious about it. But there's an idea here too, is that there was something in the garden at the beginning of time that was like a snake, that was like a person, that was like something that was winged. It was something spiritual, so it's spiritual, human, and reptilian all at the same time. And it's the animating spirit of the tree. Okay, so keep that in mind. Thus the heaven and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. So that's wisdom in that one too, I think, the idea of the Sabbath, you know, because one of the thing about hyper-conscientious people is that they'll just work till they die. And that's actually not very productive, because then they're dead and they can't work. And so what you have to do with hyper-conscientious people is you have to say, well, I know you'd rather do nothing, but let's figure out what you're up to. And what you're up to, in all probability, is the attempt to be productive in the least problematic, longest sustaining possible manner. And that might mean I used to work with lawyers, with people who had risen to the top of large law firms, and they were hyper-productive types. And they're often, you know, trying to hit their impossible quota for yearly hours, and burning themselves to a frazzle as a consequence. And one of the things that we used to do work, but what we did was we'd have them take more time off, you know, like a 4-day weekend every 2 months or something that was plotted out into the future. And then we track their billable hours, which is their degree of productivity. It would take a break. Why? Well, because you'll be more productive if you take a break. No, that couldn't possibly be. Like, I should just work flat out all the time. It's like, let's test that out. You take a break now and then. It's like, well. So there's wisdom here too, which is okay. And this alludes to the Adam and Eve story near the end. You're self-conscious. You discover the future. You have to work. Well, all the time, because no matter how much work you do, you're not solving your problems. they're coming along, man. And you can stack up all the money you want, you can stack up all the wealth you want. It is not going to protect you in the final analysis. So you better be hitting the ground running. That, well, then you die. That's not a good, it's not a good solution. So maybe you should rest. And so how does that rest get instantiated? Well, it's not easy to tell, but one way, God had to rest 1 day a week. And so you don't have to be so presumptuous to assume that if God had to rest 1 day a week, that maybe, you are allowed without a break at all. And I think our culture has slipped into that in quite a dangerous way, because everything is open all the time. And I mean, I find that just as convenient to talk to modern people, because one of the things they always tell you, we say, well, how are you? And what do they always say? They don't say good, they don't say bad, they say busy. It's like, yeah, well, okay. This is where Genesis 2 starts, and we finally got there. These are the generations of the heavens and of the earth. The Lord God made the earth and the heavens, and every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew. For the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. But there went up a mist from the earth, and watered the whole face of the ground. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Well, there's some archaic thinking in there. The breath is life, right? That's psyche, that's spirit, that's inspiration, that's respiration, that's all associated. It's pneuma, like pneumatic tire. It's breath. And the reason that people associated life with breath, well, that's not so foolish, I mean, you're breathing, man, and it's something you do all the time. And when you die, you stop breathing. About breathing is a perfectly reasonable supposition. It actually happens to be very true. And then to associate the act of creation with the act of, first of all, inspiration and respiration and the breathing of life into something that was inanimate is well, what do you expect for a one-sentence description? It's not a bad one-sentence description, So, and the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden. And Eden, I suppose if you're a desert dweller, right? Because the issue there is, can you get enough water to make things grow? And so the walled garden, which is paradise, is also Eden, which is a well-watered place. And water has the element of chaos. We already saw that in often assimilated symbolically to water. And so the idea too is that a certain amount of chaos has to be brought into the order in order for it to be fruitful. And you can see that in the form of allowing in the water. And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So 2 trees are marked out among the rest. One is the tree of life, and one is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, you know when you read something like that, if you're thinking about it, that you're in a metaphorical space. Now, we've got to be careful about metaphors, because the order idea is a metaphor, but then I also said, well, wait a second, it's a metaphor, but it's also what your brain is adapted to. And so, let's just not be pushing the idea that it's merely a metaphor too hard. And the same thing is happening here. These are metaphors, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But that doesn't exactly mean that they're mere metaphors, because sometimes, as I mentioned before, if you have a set of things and you abstract out from them a common element, you can make a strong case that the common element is more real than the set of things from which you abstracted it. That's the whole utility in abstraction. Why would you bother with it otherwise? If you can't take a set of things and say, look, there's something in common across this set of things, acting at all. And so the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil are abstractions. Now, one of the questions is, this is a tough one, man. I tried to figure out for a long time, why a fruit and something you eat of psychology, because that's basically what happens in the Adam and Eve story. Why would it be something that you eat? Now, Eric Neumann got a fair ways with it. He said, well, we've noticed forever that the act of eating, especially if you're hungry, especially if you're starving, produces a rapid worth knowing. You probably have a crabby partner or child, because everyone does, And one thing you might try is that if they get erratic during the day and, you know, get all volatile about, I'll tell you, man, this solves, I do this with my clinical clients all the time. It's like, they say, well, I fly off the handle. When you're crabby and unreasonable, eat a piece of cheese or eat a peanut butter sandwich. Eat something that's high protein, high fat. And then just wait 10 minutes and see if you're sane. And you'll find out that you just can't believe how crazy you are when you're hungry. Look, it's really absolutely bloody remarkable. Especially if you don't eat breakfast. This will change your life. And so here's a practical bit of information for you too, for all of you antisocial types who are going to end up in prison. So, and you want to go on parole. Okay, so you have to go in front of the judge and tell him why you're not going to do it again. So here's the deal. It doesn't really matter what you did, and it doesn't really matter what you promise. What matters is whether you see the judge before lunch or after lunch. The probability that you'll get parole is 60% higher. Yeah, right. That is just like, so never have an argument with your partner when you're hungry or when they're hungry, especially if you want something from them. It's like, here's a sandwich. They'll eat. Before that, man, no. So, you know, it's not that unreasonable to think that there's a spirit in food, because it rejuvenates you spiritually. And then, of course, there's the other things that we consume that aren't exactly like food, that have a, which is a spirit and is regarded, it's Dionysius, right? I mean, it's the god of the vine, and the god of the vine possesses you and makes you act all the fun ways that alcohol makes you act, you know, the fun ways. So there's the spiritual element of that too. And then, but there's something even deeper that I think is so cool that's associated with food and information. It's the fruit as producing a psychological transformation. And so the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is an abstraction common across trees. It's a fruit that's common across trees. It's something like that. And so the fruit that's common across trees is something you might call food. Fair enough, that's a generalization. But here's something that's across the entire domain of food. Information. And we use the same bloody circuits in our brain to forage for information that squirrels use to forage for food, that animals use. Because we figured out that knowing where things is, knowing where the food is more important than food is a form of meta-food. Information is a form of meta-food. And once you, well, that's why we're information foragers. And so once you grasp, headed into the story of Adam and Eve. So whatever it is that they ingest is a form of meta-food. It's information. And you know, we'll trade food for information, right? So if your hood's up and your going places thing has turned into a pile of junk that you don't understand, and somebody pulls up beside you and they're a mechanic and they point to something and say, well, just put that wire back on there, you'll immediately give them a sandwich, right? Or you'll offer them something in return, you know what I mean? Because they've provided you with information that has value. And it has value because it actually provides you with energy, because information provides you with energy, because otherwise why would we bother with it? And so food provides energy, but so does information. And so there's the idea of food that you abstract from everything you can eat, but then there's the idea of what you could abstract from all sources of food, and the answer to that would be information. And the trees that are being referred to in Adam and Eve are these meta trees. They're not ordinary trees, just like paradise is no ordinary place, just like Adam and Eve are no ordinary people, and just like the logos perception. And they're not metaphors, they're more than metaphors. I think of them as hyper realities, as something like that. Is there more to you? And lots of things are like that, right? Numbers are like that. We wouldn't think or abstract if there weren't things that were more real than what we can see. So what's And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it was parted and became into 4 heads. That's produced a tremendous amount of speculation. Now, you know, the Garden of Eden is also the holy city. That's another way of thinking about it. Or it's be the ideal city, or it could be an ideal state of being, or it could be the ideal psyche, or it's all of those things stacked up at the same time, right? And this is a Mandela, and this is the Mandela form that people, what would you call, hypothesized that constituted the structure of paradise. You notice it's got this cross form. That's Eden itself, and there's the center of Eden, and there's the rivers. Those are rivers, not snakes. Those are the rivers that go out of it, and they're turned into these Mandela images that are representative of what Jung described as the self, which would be the center element of being that he associated, of conscious being. So with the idea of the holy city. And so I'm just showing you that to show you where the imagination has taken ideas of paradise. So the name of the first river is Pison, that is which compasseth the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. There's bdellium and the onyx stone. And the name of the second river is Gihon, the same is it that compasseth the whole land of Ethiopia. And the name of the third river is Hiddekel, or Hiddekel, I don't know. That is it which goeth towards the east of Assyria, and the fourth river is the Euphrates. So there's this strange intermingling there of geography with mythical geography, right, which you see happen fairly frequently in the books. And the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to dress it and keep it. Okay, so that's a good command. That's what you're supposed to do, is take care of the damn thing. It was a lot of work to make, right? It took a whole week. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. Well, there's this bunch of questions there that people have been puzzling over for a long time. God, he's a tricky character in the story of Adam and Eve. It's like, well, okay, if we can't eat the damn thing, well, why put it in the garden to begin with? That would be one question. And you made us, and then you told us not to eat this, knowing perfectly well that the first thing we were going to do is eat it, because people are of exactly that type, which is that if you say to them with their insatiable curiosity, this is all fine and nice, but over here is something you should never look at, and then you leave the room, it's like everybody's over there trying to figure out what the hell that thing is instantly, right? Because we're curious creatures. And so you have to wonder exactly what God was up to here. And there's Gnostics. Was not really a very good God. He was kind of an unconscious evil God, in that he wanted his creation to be unconscious, and so forbade them from developing consciousness, and that it was a higher God who, and maybe in the form of the serpent, who tempted human beings towards consciousness. And you know, that idea got scrubbed out of classic Christianity pretty early, although there's something that's interesting about it, and there are remnants of it in different forms that stayed inside the story, like the idea that the fall was, you know, a terrible tragedy, but on the other hand, it was the precondition for the greatest event in history, which was the birth of Christ and the redemption of mankind. And so it's complicated, let's put it that way. God only knows what God was up to, but you know, this is a good example of that ambivalence. And to me, again, that it's an indication of the sophistication of the people who put these stories together. I also consider this somewhat miraculous, because, you know, if you were just a simple propagandist of sorts, you wouldn't leave this sort of complexity in the text. You just get rid of that, because if you're a propagandist, everything is supposed to make sense along the ideological plane. And here, God's supposed to be good. It's like, well, we better get there to that line, because something's up with it, and it isn't obvious that they were doing two things. Is they were trying not to be too careless with the traditions that they were handed. They also that they were actually trying to understand what was going on, because why otherwise keep this? Why not just simplify it? That would be easier than having God do it. And the Lord God said, it is not good that man should be alone. I will make a helpmeet for him. And out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every fowl of the air, and brought them unto Adam to see what he would call them. And whatsoever Adam called every living creature, that was the name thereof. And Adam gave name to the fowl of the air, and to every beast of the field, but for Adam there was not found a helpmeet for him. Number one, it's like, why does God care what Adam calls the animals? And the answer to that seems to be that it's associated again with the magic of speech, right? So that we know, according to the story, that human beings were already all order forth from chaos, and that human beings were made in that image. And so there's an echo of that here, even though it's from an independent tradition. And the echo is, and that's an interesting thing, and we don't exactly know how far that extends. It's certainly the case that things often exist in a strange potential, like a massive confusion. Before you put your finger on it, name it. What's going on here? You name it. It's like it carves it out from all that underlying chaos. It makes it into a grippable entity that you can then contend with. And you might say, well, it was, yes, it was real before you named it, the same way things are there when there's no one there to perceive them. And it isn't obvious how things, there's something bloody weird about perception. You can look this up. John Wheeler's a physicist. So here's a really cool thing. Let's say you go outside, and so a photon from that star enters your eye, and maybe that photon has been cruising along for like 30 million years. Do you know that that photon would not have been there at that time to receive it? You think, well, how in the hell can that be? Because it happened 20 million years ago. It's like, well, I don't know. Has done a very good job of detailing out why that's true and necessarily true. And so, and Wheeler is also the physicist who developed the notion of it from bit, and he believes that the world is best construed as a place of information. It's something like latent information, and that what consciousness does is transform the latent information into something like concrete reality. And he doesn't mean that metaphorically. The story that I just told you is that the photon couldn't have leapt from where it was unless it had a place to go. Now it's complicated and confusing, because from the perspective of a beam of light, from a photon, there is no time, and there's no, completely impossible to understand too, but from the perspective of a photon, the universe is completely flat, perpendicular to the direction that the photon is traveling. So it's there and here at the same time. For us, it's not. It's like 20 million years ago, but for the photon, it's... The reason I'm telling you all that is because the relationship between consciousness and reality is by no means straightforward. It is seriously not straightforward. And physicists debate what the relationship is between consciousness and reality, and they debate about what. If I enter into that debate, because I'm not a physicist, but I do know, and I've read a fair bit of Wheeler, about as much of it as I can understand, and I do at least know that that's what is not. That's a claim that's taken seriously among physicists of the caliber of the physicists who can understand Wheeler. There is emphasis again on this importance of naming in order to make things real. You know, and sometimes people won't name things just so they don't become real. So, you know, if you have a relationship, which undoubtedly you do, and it has problems, which undoubtedly it does, you wants to name, and everybody's thinking, well, as long as we don't name it, it's not really there. And in some sense, it really isn't there, because you can act as if it's not there and get away with it, at least for short periods of time. But as soon as you name that thing, it's like you give it form and it's there and no one can ignore it. And that's annoying, because then you have to deal with it. The reason I'm telling you that is because we have an intuition even that we can have things not exist by not naming them. Name it and it comes forward with staggering clarity. And it's not as if naming opens it and brings it into focus and gives it borders and barriers, borders and boundaries. And what Adam has to say, that he has him name all the animals, and that sort of makes them into animals. Now, there's more to the linguistic story than that. So interesting phenomena which is associated with relationship between perception and action. You know how a kid will call a particular animal, a cat. Well, the word cat is very short, like the word dog. And it turns out that, you know, you could think that we could perceive cats as multicellular organisms, like we could see, or we could see the ecosystem that the cat is part of, but we don't, or maybe the broader mammalian classification that it's part of. We could perceive that as the unit of cat. And you can tell the perceptual level that people naturally perceive at, which doesn't seem to be socioculturally determined to any great degree, by the way, because the words are often short and easily remembered. Analysis, out of all the possible levels of analysis that the world does exist at, we perceive it at a certain level of analysis, and that level of analysis seems to have something at that level. And the perception at that level and the naming at that level gives things a reality at that level. You know, because the thing about things is that they're not all sorts of strange ways. And yet when we cast our eye and use our language to orient ourselves in the world, we cut things up into discrete about that makes them real in a way that they're interconnected potential. It's not real in the same way, at least. I think it's even less real. I think that's a right way of thinking about it, even though it's not completely. A little God at that point, a little God the Father, and God's already done the groundwork, but Adam has to come along and say, well, that's a cat. It's like, poof, whatever that is now a cat. And it gives them something like pragmatic form. But for Adam there was not found a helpmeet for him. And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept, and God took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh instead thereof. And the rib which the Lord God had taken from man made he a woman, and brought her unto the man. And Adam said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore and they shall be one flesh. That's a walloping statement to put in there at the end of those 3 sentences. I mean, the therefore comes as somewhat of a surprise, but there's an injunction there. Well, it's a good injunction, man. I'll tell you, people who don't do that, they have a hell of a time in their marriage. And so this is a good thing to know. If you are married, or if you're planning to get married, is like, you know, we have very strong orientation towards our parents, and for good reason. It's like the injunction here is, that's secondary as soon as you're married. And failure to do that makes your marriage collapse. And then you deserve it to collapse too, as far as I'm concerned, because it's a reflection of your pathological immaturity and your unwillingness to parents who are a little bit too much on the interfering side. But the injunction, there's a deep injunction here. It's very complicated. So one of the ideas is that the original Adam wasn't a man, like being, and in that hermaphroditic being there was a kind of undifferentiated perfection, and then that was split into male and female, and then that part of the goal of human that reestablishes the initial perfection, and that's actually the goal of marriage from a spiritual perspective. And that's lovely. It's such a good idea. So I had these friends that went to Sweden. His heritage, both their heritages were Swedish, and in this being married, and they had to hold a candle up between them, right, while they were being married. And you think, well, okay, what's the candle? Right, it's a source of enlightenment. It's the candle that you put on Christmas trees in Europe. So it's the light that emerges in the darkness, in the depth of winter. It's a symbol of life in dark. At the darkest, coldest time of the year, which is also associated symbolically with the birth of Christ. All that. And then the next question is, why do you hold it above you? And the answer, it simplifies something transcendent. And so why do you both hold on to it? Well, because you're both supposed to hold on to the light. And so you ask, well, who's in charge in a marriage? Well, the light. That's the idea. things. It isn't what's good for you, and it's not what's good for your wife. It's what's good for the marriage, and the marriage is of the original hermaphroditic, and that's all packed into like these 4 sentences. And you know, there's been, well, just endless and endless and endless, and that's one of the lines. And so it's also an antidote to the idea that women, logical process, by the way, makes women in some sense subordinate to men. That is not. And there's something else that's associated with it too, and there's an idea that, you know, in Sleeping Beauty, you know, Sleeping Beauty goes to sleep, and the reason she goes to sleep is because who are quite old, and so they're pretty desperate to have a child, like so many people are now, and they only have one child, like so many people. Child, because like, hey, it's a miracle, and there's only one of them, and so, and she's the princess, and so it's like, we're not, and they invite everybody, but they don't invite, she's nature, she's like the thing that goes bump in the night, she's the devil herself, so to speak, she's everything. Well, we just won't invite her to the christening. It's like, good luck with that. That's an Oedipal story, right? The Oedipal mother is the mother who devours her child by refusing, by overprotecting him or her. So the terrible world, they're weakened by too much protection, and then when they're let out into the world, they cannot live. And that's the story. Apologize to Maleficent when she first shows up, and say, well, you know, they have a bunch of half-witted excuses why they don't invite her. You don't forget something like that. And she kind of makes that point. It's right, the whole horror of life. You don't forget about that when you have a child, that's for sure. You might wish that it would stay at bay. Party? And the answer is, it bloody well depends how unconscious you want your child to be. And if you want your child to be unconscious, well, then you have the added advantage that maybe they won't leave home, and so you can take to find something to do for yourself. Well, and then of course you can take revenge on them if they do have any what would you call impetus towards courage that you sacrificed yourself 30 years ago and want to stamp out as soon as you see it develop in your child. That's another thing that would be quite pleasant. Well, none of this is pleasant, and nothing that happens in that story is pleasant. So Sleeping Beauty, she's naive as hell. They put her out in the forest and have her raised by these 3 like devoid of any real potency and power, right? There's nothing maleficent about them. And then the first idiot prince that wanders by, she stress disorder when he rides off on his horse, right? That's what happened. Freaked out because she met the love of her life for like 5 minutes, for God's sake. And you know, that's when the finger, right? They try to get rid of all the spinning wheels. They try to get rid of all the wheels of fate with their pointed end, but she finds it, pricks her fingers, and falls down unconscious. Well, she wants to be unconscious her whole life. She's so damn naive that her first love affair just about kills her. She wants to go to sleep and never wake up, and so that's exactly what happens. And then she has to wait. Can you get that story? Well, seriously, because that's the way that would be read in the modern world. It's like made Frozen that absolutely appalling piece of rubbish. You can say, well, the princess doesn't need a prince to rescue her, but you know, that's a boneheaded way of looking at the story. Woman, and believe me, he's got his own problems, right? He's got a whole goddamn dragon he has to contend with, but the consciousness is presented very frequently. And the idea is that without that forward-going, courageous consciousness, a woman herself will drift into unconsciousness and terror. And needs a man to wake her up, and of course, just like a man needs a woman to wake him up, it's the same damn thing. That's the dragon fight in Sleeping Beauty. She can do is lay there and sleep, like the sleep of the naive and damned. She has to wake herself up and bring her own consciousness, her own masculine consciousness in. Women are trying to do that like mad, but that's partly what's represented in the story like that, and that's partly what taken out of man, so to speak. Then she isn't a human being, she's just a creature, and that's partly what's embedded in this story. I don't want to read anything that way. It's so really it's yeah, I won't bother with that, but really we can do better than that, man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother and shall cleave unto his wife. The other thing about marriage, this is really worth knowing too, is that I learned this in part from reading Jung. You take someone who's just as useless and horrible as you are, and then you shackle yourself to them, and then you say, we're not running away. Well, that's perfect, because then you don't get to run away. And the thing is like, if you tell someone the truth about you and they don't marry, it's a losing bet, we both know that, but better, that's for sure. You know, there are two things that come off of right. It's like, here's something to think about. Found Mr. Right, and he looked at you, Mr. Right at all, right? It's like someone loves you, that should immediately disenchant you with them. I never belonged to a club that would take me as a member. Very interesting thing to think about. And so as imperfect as you are, you might be in a situation where well, there's some things about you that aren't going so right, and there's some things, the consequences for the next 50 years. So we can suffer through it for the next 5 decades. And you know, those problems will not be solved. The same thing when you're living together with someone, you know, it's not less likely. And the reason for that is, just think about it. Well, you're but I'd like to reserve the right to stumble into me. Well, how could now they're willing to play along with it because they're going to do the same thing with you. Well, you're not going to commit to me, so that means you don't value me or our relationship. If I need to, then I'm willing to put up with that. But is it to shackle yourself to someone? It's like, it's stupid. It's pretty damn good, because with ever learn, because you'll avoid them. You can truth. It's as simple as that, because you can just leave. So there's some representations of the idea. This is an old Chinese. I think I have the pronunciation wrong, but it's really cool. See, it's a DNA symbol, which I find very interesting. That's sort of the potential out of which that emerges, and so that's like the predatory unknown of mankind is something like that, is the predatory unknown. Cognitive elements of human perception, mask. Chinese, this is Egyptian, also extraordinarily. Everything, Cyrus, king of an old alchemical symbol. I love this one. Yeah, and that's not accidental, by the way. And the seeker that chases this, hell J.K. Rowling knew that. I cannot figure out, because that is Google. It's called the Round Chaos, my webpage. And so, I mean, I know she looked at a lot of old texts, but the idea that all the games is exactly right, and that's the motif. So there's the potential. That's like the potential out of which God, some kind of, that's the dragon, you know, the Eden, and then that's the manifestation of predatory unknown, masculine representation of the evolutionary history. And that's also an image of the ideal creature, hermaphroditic, at the beginning of time before the fall. And it's the purpose. All of that in these images, it's just and there's some more classical representation. And this is a cool line. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. Well, see, someone who wrote this, and so there's this intimation that of two things. Number one is there was a point in time when point of time, which is now, where they're naked and they are ashamed of it. And then the question is, well, what's the association? It's often given a sexual connotation in classic interpretations of the Adam and Eve story because of its association with that. So you think, I noticed revealing this in this lecture, but my daughter was never really concerned about nudity when she was a little kid. It was all. By the time he was 3, man, that kid was private. His bedroom door was shut, the bathroom door was shut. It was like, get the hell out of here. And that seemed to just was like that, and the other one wasn't. I didn't think we had much to do with it at all, but it was really fascinating to watch that emerge in him. And you know, that sense of self-consciousness does seem to emerge in children somewhere around the that maybe having your baby wander around naked on a beach isn't exactly the best idea. There's something like that. It's the nudity in children is generally okay under some circumstances in public display. We seem to think of that as merely it's acceptable. Why? I don't know why it stopped, obviously, but it's a very complicated phenomena. But you know, the whole nudity thing, first of all, people are kind of strange because we're hairless, roughly, you know, compared to most animals, and we don't know wandering around in the desert, running around in Africa, because we're really, really good runners. We can run down animals, say, like we can really run, man, and a lot of our ancestors, the Kalahari Bushmen, still do this. Dies. And the bushman doesn't die. I mean, they also sometimes shoot them with poison arrows, but they can just run them until they die. So we have tremendous endurance, and you have to be able to get rid of a lot of heat. That's one explanation. And Buckminster Fuller had an interesting explanation, which was he thinks that at some point during our evolution, we spend a lot of time near the water, and so we're like fish apes, something like that. And we like to swim, and we're really good at swimming for terrestrial creatures, like some sea-going creatures do, and women have a layer of subcutaneous kind of, our feet are, which are very odd things, are kind of good for flapping in the water, although we can also walk with them, and to a water existence like seals and so forth. Like we kind of went back to the ocean, but not quite. And so, but it certainly does make us exposed to the world in a way that animals that have a covering of fur aren't. And then on all fours, and so their very vulnerable parts are protected. When you're standing up nude, let's call it your psychophysiological quality is on painful display, right? Look at the feminist tack, for example, on beauty. The idea that women have eating disorders is directly attributed to magazines, something like that. Even though women buy those magazines and they're attracted to them, and their mood goes up when they purchase them. And if women would avoid the magazines and not buy them. So as a theory, it's a very, very bad one. But it's still the case that, you know, it's still the case that if you're not ugly now, man, you're going to be at some point in your life. So that's kind of a rough thing to contend with, right? It's that you could be, and maybe even once were, that you're not going to be for long, or never were. And it's really an appalling issue, because I think it's harder on women, because women are judged by men more. And fertility, that's how it turns out from the evolutionary point of view. Men are judged more on their socioeconomic status by women. It's harsh both ways. But so anyways, it's, you know, it's a terrible thing to carry. You're exposed to the most serious possible evaluation of the quality of your being that you can possibly be exposed to all the time. And and so part of clothing is protection, but a tremendous amount of it is merely stopping other people from evaluating you too harshly all the time. It just gets in the way. Anyways, this story makes the case that, so it seems perfectly plausible that at some point we weren't like that, but at some point that changed. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. Of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said unto the woman, Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden. I like this. This is, who is it? Doré, yeah, Doré, exactly. Doré did etchings for Paradise Lost that are absolutely here. And of course, in the Genesis story, Satan is weirdly associated with the snake, and I'll tell you, that's a story of Adam and Eve. There's no indication whatsoever that the serpent, who evil, and how in the world those two stories got tangled together. But it took a very long time to figure it out, and it's absolutely, it's so bloody brilliant. I just can't believe that people figured it out. It's so unbelievably spectacular. An intimation of that idea, right? That there's a kinship between these two things. So anyways, the serpent's more subtle than any beast of the field. Subtle's an interesting word. This is from the Oxford English Dictionary. So, because we'll amplify the word a bit, this is at the connotations of the concepts that are associated with the dream. Subtle, of a person or animal in action, behavior, crafty, cunning, sly, something that you really pick up on that easily. Of a look or glance, sly, furtive, surreptitious. Of a person, skillful, expert, clever. Of a work of art, mechanical device, cleverly made. All those terms so far are fairly well attributed to snakes. I mean, they are very cool things and subtle. On the nature of or involving careful discrimination of fine points, abstruse. Of a person or intellectual activity characterized by interesting because Milton's Satan is also the intellect. The bad guy's an evil scientist, right? And there's something about, and you see the same thing in The Lion King with Scar. I mean, Scar is an intellect. Scar, he's not wise, but he's the evil voice that's always whispering in the king's ear, and that's associated with the pride of the intellect. What produced somewhat of the schism, if you look at the historical record. The idea was that the intellect has its own particular, it's a remarkable faculty. Let's say it's the highest rated, but it's also the thing that can go most terribly wrong, because the intellect can become arrogant about its own existence products, and that's what happens when you're ideologically possessed, because you end up with a dogma, like say a human you completely, of which you believe is 100% right? So it eradicates the necessity for any element of the intellect that's associated symbolically with the snake in the Garden of Paradise, of a feeling, sense, sensation, especially to such an extent to be difficult to discern or analyze, also almost imperceptible and elusive, having little thickness or breadth, rarefied matter, barely there at all. And the woman said unto the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the garden. God has said, ye shall not eat of it, neither shall you. Said to the woman, ye shall not surely die, for God doth know in the day that you eat thereof, knowing good and evil. Sneaky, subtle. It's a nice story, eh? Implication is, well, you can't trust God, so that's pretty. Last one on you, and the next one is, well, he's trying to do that because he's jealous. So good, and if you eat it, contrary to what you've been informed, then all that's going to happen sounds pretty damn good. And Eve not to eat. Right, so obedient enough so they don't get hurt, courageous, and they break some. It's a very paradoxical story. And so Eve pays images, right? We have this strange serpent that's associated with the snake wasn't, and three primary predators: snakes. And so this and the or something most susceptible, and the reason, and so women are more self cross culture is, as far as we so small alteration, but what in terms of sight, so she her additional ordinarily of emotion is not to pay attention to the snake. That's I can't remember in my new book about this, where 1% of the adults children had been killed by them. So shaped our evolutionary path. We're attuned to snakes. An anthropologist say, see them. Knowing is one day we might live. Same thing, and the same so interesting between what you eat and information. It's also the case that we can see color because we evolved to see ripe fruit. These are given vision by the. So isn't that something? Well, first they make themselves conscious and don't precisely conscious than being rejected. Well, obviously, has said material should propagate self-conscious by attention. Something really divulge whatever. That's it. Diverge between us and chimpanzee and extensive in women towards a man of his that's been tested. It's his and to share, right? But the capacity, more important element, women have to have infants. Just looking logically, that's women who are hyper or the most competent seem to be what over the course of it. Pleasant to the eyes, wise. They've also unto that right, most animals in the hunt, you eat, and if there's some left, we share food. A female creature, a twist in that, only with your entice a mate. That's the offering of. Here's part of, and in well, and that's the body. And that's something that needs explanation. Did eat, and they were sort of just happened. Oh. Heard. You don't lay time, more or less kind of light of wind clothing. The first world. The surprise of snakes is Beltel. The neurobiological, that's from 2000. Focus up. temptation to fruit eating and make themselves look like right. The Lord God walking themselves from the presence of being woken. Now where are they hiding from? Okay, so think, imagine that obviously might not. How would that of live analogous? Well, what's it's their own race. How supposed to hide? And we thought some serious trouble. Hide. Yeah, that's so funny. Where have I come? Adam glory said the woman she tempted worse, although he so it just means but it's after. First of all, it wasn't him, it was and back like this. It's like, and that's read uninterest, so his but it thou art belly shalt thou eat. Lizard put enmity you away child that patterned of the protecting they'll bring a brain that's of which for bring forth and because you're there's no other it's become also of every way okay good and evil of the blood of Christ and realizing tell you something you're getting your warnings Japanese unit they did and that's really something and they would put the arms would freeze so and repeat that vulnerable. If we the snake eat, so the becomes potential. You got pop up inside. Isn't just me, right? Because you're what that talk to has insistent
kind of clash, lack thereof, of a human fetus, and how that's impacted your views on abortion, whatever they are.
oh. Thank you. I'm very okay, so the first to actually reveal. I can flail about a little bit around it. I don't think anybody debates that. You wouldn't recommend that someone that you, having clarified that complexity of the situation. Should everything wrong be illegal? That's a tough question. Everything, additional complication of the difference, let's say, in regarding the problem in relationship. Having said that, I would say that it's there's something Leonard Cohen said once. He said that in a massacre there's no decent place where there is no good decision left. So then the question is where you are inclined to seek an abortion. There. Now, we have a lot to straighten between men and women in the modern world. Okay, one of the things I see with young people, for example, would not talk about with one another. They're married, that's a different story. Act with someone with whom you would not discuss that act, you probably put the cart before. The discussion regarding larger discussion about them nested inside a larger discussion about the proper. To me, that's the level at which I don't have the answer to that, you know, because the old answer was an answer that people should still listen to. But I had a client at one point who was going to disguise her in a variety of different ways. She was 27, 20. Quite a timid, fearful person, and sophisticated in relationships, and she'd never had sex. Well, her wasn't continue to be timid about everything, because that wasn't working out for her. She needed to go have some adventures. Now, sexual adventures, like other adventures, are dangerous. And so you have to be very careful when you encourage people to go out and have adventures. But too much timidity and caution also constitutes a pathway to perdition, let's say. You can't just say to people in the modern world, well, no sex till you're married, unless you're going to get married when you're very young, and perhaps you should. I don't know about that. But I don't think that we're mature enough as a culture to have a serious discussion about sexual propriety, especially in the aftermath of the birth control pill. And we seriously need to do that, and we haven't. And so I think the eternal debate about abortion, horrible as it is it's the surface manifestation of a much deeper problem. Now, I talked a little bit today about the utility of marriage, like the spiritual utility of marriage. And that's something that I think we're so immaturely cynical as a culture. Like we're not wise enough to look at an institution like marriage and to really think about what it means and what it signifies. It signifies a place that people can tie the ropes of their lives together so that they're stronger. It signifies a place where people can tell the truth to one another. It signifies a place where sexuality can properly be integrated into life. That's no easy task. It's a place where children, at least in principle, can be put first and foremost, as they should be once they exist. And so there's a much broader discussion that has to happen, I think, before any concentration on the legality of abortion is liable to get anywhere at all. That's what it looks like to me. So that's the best I can do with that question.
Hi, Dr. Peterson. Earlier you showed a picture of Fuxi and Nua.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and Osiris. And in your Maps of Meaning lectures, you also explained that cultures around the world have these twin snakes that are...
Yeah, they're everywhere, man.
Yeah, and so you mentioned that you believe this is a representation of DNA.
You would bring that up too. Jesus, what is it with you guys tonight? Yeah, well, yeah. No, I wouldn't say I believe that. I have my suspicions that that might be it. Yeah, because believe is too strong a word, but those representations are everywhere. And read this book. This is a good one. Oh man, now I have to remember the book. It's by an anthropologist who went down to the Amazon jungle and experimented intensively with ayahuasca. I think it's called The Cosmic Serpent. I think that's the name of the book. You could read that. There's another one called Breaking Open the Head, which is also pretty damn interesting. And there's something to those books. I mean, The Cosmic Serpent kind of goes off on a bit of a tangent, I would say, although Breaking Open the Head it's better. Better. It seems to stay more constrained and tight, but we don't know the limits of our perception, especially under certain conditions. And I think people have had intimations of DNA as the cosmic serpent forever. So, yeah. But that's way out on the frontiers of my knowledge, right? Like, I'm guessing in a dreamlike way when I'm making statements like that. So.
Because you did mention that you did believe in, and that there were sort of maybe some dreams and interpretations that might have emerged, but I don't see how we could have perceived DNA as it is.
Right. Well, yes, we didn't objectively, but I'm not so sure we didn't subjectively. But I mean, it's very strange that these double helixes exist in so many places, and that they're often utilized as healing symbols with the snake. So, anyways, like I said, that's, what do you call that? It's not hypothesizing, it's one thing worse than that. Speculating. Those are speculations. I'm operating at the edge of my understanding. But our perceptions are very mutable, and we can see things under some conditions that you wouldn't think that anybody can see. So, okay, yep.
So I was just sort of have a thought while you were talking about sort of getting to the end of talking about the snake and the apple and so on. So what you're saying is the moment that Adam and Eve eat the apple, they become nervous or whatever. So that's awareness of their own vulnerabilities, and then like you said, it's also awareness of their own capacity to do harm. So it's like when they are eating the apple, then that's them their immediate sort of nervous reaction is because they ate the apple and they kind of became evil in that moment or something like that. So,
Well, they woke up, and because they woke up and realized how they could be hurt, how they could and would be hurt over the upcoming, over time. It's the same as the discovery of the discovery of your own nakedness and the discovery of time are very, very similar phenomena. I mean, sure, as soon as you know how you can be hurt. Well, you know, if you have to just consult your evil fantasies, it's like, what'll really hurt him? Oh yeah, that would work. It's like, how do you know that? Well, you just think about it. What would happen if that happened to me? That would hurt. Oh yeah, that'll work. It'll hurt him or her. And you know, you probably think that way twice a week or maybe twice a day. Jesus, every time you have an argument with someone, all you have to do is look at the back of your mind a little bit. You don't want to, that's for sure. But if you do, you'll see these sorts of thought processes generating constantly. It's like, you know, in a back and forth discussion, particularly with people you love, it's like you're always looking for a place to put the knife in.
So then it seems really similar to me, or it seems like they're kind of discovering the kind of like Jungian shadow within themselves, so that is the moment where it got introduced into the human spirit.
Sure.
And one of the things about the shadow is that it's also, when you integrate that, that's what makes you a substantial person.
Right.
So it's like, it seems to me that on one hand, well, it seems like this tragedy that Satan, the most evil, the father of evil, whatever, has introduced into people, but it also seems like without that shadow that people are kind of insubstantial. So
yeah, well, right. I mean, that, like I said, that there's been a multitude of interpretations emerge as a consequence of that story. What was God up to? Was God in fact evil, the initial God? Like, why would he create a snake? Why would he put it in the garden? Why would there be these trees? What the hell is going on with the whole Satan thing? You know, it's very, very problematic. Well, we'll talk about it more. And this, again, is, let's call it speculation. Well, if you want to make something strong, you test it. And maybe if you want to make something ultimately strong, you test it ultimately. And I think that there's an aspect of being that has that element, is that human beings are tested ultimately. It's partly because we know good and evil now. And so that's the landscape in which we exist. So you could say the landscape is a cross. It's chaos and order, and it's good and evil. And we're stuck in the middle between those two things. It's a very common theme, by the way, in video games. Exactly that. Chaos, order, good, evil. It's the basic plot of endless video games. And that's perhaps because it's the basic plot. Those are the things we have to contend with. Well, I had a vision once. I shouldn't tell you this, but I will anyways. I had a vision once that I went to heaven, and I was put in a Roman amphitheater with Satan, just like Thor encountering the Hulk, right? That's coming up in that new Avengers movie. And so that was rather a shock, because I thought that was a hell of a thing to happen in heaven. And so I had this battle, and I won. And at the end, I came up to God and said, like, you know, what's with the whole Roman amphitheater thing there? It seemed like a bit over the top to me. I said, why would you put me in a ring with something like that? And he said, because I knew you could win. And you know, I don't know what to make of that. One thing I should make of it is I shouldn't tell you, but whatever. But you know, there's something to that in my estimation. It's like, do you protect the people you love, or do you try to make them strong?
So you think it's not that we have like Satan to thank for making us substantial, it's that God gave us Satan in order to make us substantial?
Well, I'd hesitate to say that, because you know, it's so cut and dried. But I would say that that's a strong underlying theme in the biblical narrative. Yes. Now, it's certainly not the only theme. It's not the only interpretation by any stretch of the imagination. But there is something there. And there's something there, you know, at the end, we didn't talk about this. God puts up this flaming sword and these cherubim to keep you away from the tree of life. It's like, it seemed, if paradise and immortality are the promised land, then what's with the whole flaming angel and sword thing? We could have just had the damn fruit 5,000 years ago and not bothered with the problem. Well, it seems to me that there's something like, I don't know what it is, consciousness through tragedy, clarity through suffering, maybe something like that, or maybe the perfection that lurks as a potential in the future is something that has to be earned rather than given. Maybe it has no value without free choice. Maybe we have to distinguish between good and evil now that we have the capacity to actually apprehend them. Maybe that's what life is about. Maybe that's the separating of the wheat from the chaff. See, that's the idea in Revelation, right? Because when Christ comes back in the book of Revelation, he divides the damned from the saved. And the saved are the people who lived in Logos, roughly speaking, and the damned are those who don't. And so there's this idea that there's this dynamic that underlies experience that is in fact that sorting. Now, I don't know what to make of that at all, but that's the story. But what I can make of that is that I can't put a lever underneath the argument that I just made tonight about the relationship between the development of vision, the snake, the fruit, nakedness, time, the future, work, and most importantly, the emergence of evil. That seems to me to be, I cannot find a way to undermine that argument. It seems, I can't break it, and that's what I'm always looking for when I'm trying to formulate ideas. I'm trying to look for something that no matter how hard I try, I cannot break, and I can't break that set of ideas. Now, what the full implication is of that set of ideas, God only knows, right? But I could say also practically, you know, one of the things that I've observed is that lies and deception destroy people's lives. And when they start telling the truth and acting it out, things get a lot better. Gotta stop. I'm going to read you something. I get a lot of mail, and I don't know where I got this. I've been a lot of different places in the last week, and this showed up at one of them, and I'm going to read it to you. I have no idea what to make of it. It's written in a female hand, so that's about all I can tell, but there's no address or name on it. This isn't a question, but a comment, or more accurately, perhaps, a message. I spent this past weekend in an ayahuasca ceremony, which for those of you who don't know, is a South American visionary plant medicine. Some of you may roll your eyes at this, but ayahuasca brings you into direct contact with the archetypal realm of being. Users of this medicine, initiates I should say, refer to ayahuasca as she, because the spirit of the plant is decidedly feminine. An encounter with ayahuasca is an encounter with the great mother of creation, the goddess, the void from which all things come, the feminine counterpart of Logos. Dr. Peterson, you appeared in one of my ayahuasca visions. Might account for why I've been rather fatigued lately. Dr. Peterson, you appeared in one of my ayahuasca visions, and I asked her, who is Jordan Peterson? What is he doing? Which is something I'd really like to know as well. And she responded with crystalline clarity, quote, he is here to invoke and initiate the divine masculine principle on earth at this time. So I'm up here to thank you deeply and profoundly on behalf of the Great Mother herself, the goddess, the divine feminine principle, who has been eagerly awaiting the awakening of the masculine principle into divinity and service. So, You don't get a letter like that every day. Actually, I get a letter or two like that every day. So you know, what went through my head when I read this, and this is of course a completely crazy parallel, but you know, one of the things I learned to do as a psychotherapist was just to tell people who were talking to me what came into my head. It isn't what I'm thinking exactly, because that's not exactly the same thing, you know. What comes into your head is more like a dream. It comes unbidden. It's like your imagination. If you're thinking, there seems to be like a voluntary element of that, right? I mean, who God only knows how we think, but it seems partly voluntary at least. And Carl Jung thought about it like a dialogue between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. It was a constant, continual dialogue. But when things just pop into your mind, it's not much different than walking into a room, having something there, which is an observation I also derived from Jung, by the way, because he pointed out, quite rightly, that people don't really think, that thoughts appear to them. Now you can think, because you can take the thoughts that appear to you, and then you can subject them to criticism and elaboration and so on, instead of just assuming that they're true right off the bat. But people often don't do that. Something just pops into their head and then they assume that it's true. Anyways, one of the things that I tend to do in psychotherapy is just to tell people what pops into my head, because, well, why? Because then the person that is talking to me gets one person's untrammeled opinion. Not even that, reaction, not opinion. It's not really an opinion, I don't think. An opinion maybe is what I think later, and there's this personal flavor to it. What popped into my head was the story about Socrates, you know. He had this, when he was being put on trial by the Athenians for corrupting the nation's youth, something I've been accused of, by the way. Although it's not self-evident to me that it's me doing the corrupting. He said that somebody had asked the Delphic Oracle once, and the Delphic Oracle was this retreat that you could go to if you were an ancient Greek citizen, and you'd be there and you'd have a dream, and then you'd go ask the Delphic Oracle to interpret it. And nobody really knows what was up with the Delphic Oracle today, how that worked exactly, but she would interpret your dream in any case. And somebody once asked her who the wisest man in Greece was, and the Delphic Oracle said it was Socrates, because he knew he didn't know anything. That's essentially the story. And that popped into my mind. It's a crazy comparison, but you know, I have a crazy mind, so I guess that's how it works out. So now one of the things I'm going to do today, which I haven't done before, is I'm going to read you a little bit of, I told you I finished my book last week, and I haven't read it to anyone. I have given it to a couple of friends to review. One person in particular, a screenwriter named Greg Hurwitz, has been unbelievably helpful. He's so fast and so sharp at this sort of thing, and I can send him like a 20-page, dense 20-page manuscript, and he'll rip it to shreds and send it back to me in like 90 minutes. It's just unbelievable. He's so good at that. He's been very helpful, but no one else has seen it apart from my editor, and I haven't read it to anyone. But some of it seemed particularly appropriate for tonight's lecture. So I thought I would start the lecture tonight by reading a little bit of it, and it's from a chapter. It's on the issue of sacrifice as such. This is Abraham and Isaac. This is a very strange Old Testament story, right? This is one of the stories that's contained in the Old Testament that makes modern people think that maybe we should just not have that much to do with the Old Testament per se, and at all, and especially with regards, and maybe we shouldn't have anything to do with the God of the Old Testament either, because, I mean, as far as Abraham is concerned, God tells him to sacrifice his own son. Now, it turns out that God was just kidding, so to speak. You know, I'm obviously being flippant, but, you know, it does raise the question, what do you make of a divine being who would require such a thing? Or, conversely, what do you make of Abraham, who would have such delusions? Either way, it's a little hard on the, what would you call, modern believability and moral integrity of the Old Testament. But these are very, very strange stories, and they're not what they seem to be, or they are, and they're more. So we're going to talk a lot about sacrifice tonight. And here's some of the things that I've been thinking about sacrifice. So this is from, this book is called 12 Rules for Life, an Antidote for Chaos. And it's coming out in January, which I think I mentioned. And this is from Rule 7, which is do what is meaningful, not what is expedient. And so here's some of the writing I've been doing over the last 3 years on the motif of sacrifice. I'll start with just a brief intro before I read this. It took me a long time to understand what was meant in the Old Testament by sacrifice, which is strange because once I figured it out, it seemed bloody obvious. It seemed like, oh yeah, obviously that's what it means. But lots of times, if you figure something out correctly, it seems self-evident as soon as you figured it out correctly. We'll see how that goes, but you know, it seemed to work for me anyways.